about something that I think goes unaddressed in our everyday lives. That is that I want to talk to you about intimate partner violence and sexual violence against Native American men. Now, generally when we talk about these things, the narratives we construct is kind of a non-specific narrative about the violence that women face. And I think this narrative is really important, and I don't want this to compete with that at all. But what I'd like to do is examine the ways in which, when we don't take into account the intersections of identity, one's race, socioeconomic status, ability, gender, and sexuality, we can create harmful assumptions about the ways that we act towards one another. So men who go through this experience describe it as traumatic, not just because of the obvious nature of the experience, but because there's this kind of interesting framing of masculinity, of men as inviolable, or the ones who are always perpetuating this violence. So when you have this, you create these narratives where the voices of Native men are often lost, undocumented, or forgotten. Because in the narratives of masculinity and femininity, it is women who are raped and men who do the raping. So what the problem here is, though, is that this creates a unique violence in the way that being framed as not only the perpetrators of this violence, but being inviolable, means that these experiences shatter the ideals of masculinity in a way that we often don't think about. And this problem isn't small or inconsequential either. The lifetime rate for sexual and intimate partner violence against Native American men is roughly the same for Native American women, more than 4 and 5, which is vastly more than the national average. More specifically, 1 in 4 Native men will experience sexual violence, including being made to penetrate, being penetrated, or being coerced into having sex with another. Now, in terms of intimate partner violence, 43% and 73% of Native men will experience physical or psychological violence in their lifetimes. Some of these rates are more than 2 times the rate of men nationally. But when we look at lifetime rates of violence, they don't encapsulate how everyday and common this problem is. In fact, every year, more than 1 in 3 Native men will experience sexual violence, psychological or physical intimate partner violence, or stalking. Now, usually when these things are going on, people tend to ask, what's happening in our communities? Where are we going wrong in our families and relationships? But the problem with this is that the majority of this violence is not coming from our communities. More than 9 in 10 of the perpetrators of this violence for both Native American men and women are non-natives. And for Native American men, the majority of these perpetrating these violence are women. What does it mean for our narratives of sexual violence to understand white womanhood as a threat to Native men? In contrast to the historical narratives which have positioned Native men as savages who threaten the livelihoods of white women, the reverse in our society seems to be true. How do we address problems like this when intra-community conversations aren't grappling with or addressing the majority of the people who are perpetuating the problem? In order to grapple with this issue somewhat, I spent a summer at New York University studying sexual violence and the way that it impacts Native American men and women. Now, the first answer to why this is happening is simple. It's colonization. Some of Christopher Columbus's first writings about Native Americans describe the land as a woman's breast calling for ravishment, or describe Native American women as particularly lascivious. And this certainly creates a historical context for Native American women's violence. But colonial writings on Native American men are somewhat stranger. They seem to oscillate between, savages who are coming to get every white woman, and as undersexed beings who, in failing to rape white women captives, have failed to truly be men. What does this mean for our collective imaginaries and the way that we think about Native men? The first is that Native American men get hyper-sexualized. The idea of Native Americans, men and women, as primitive and savage put them in this position of unconstrained sexuality, outside of taboo and always ready to go. And Native Americans became this taboo site of desire, but a site of desire nonetheless. And for Native American women, this took and takes place in the sexual violence that plagues our communities. But this added part of reluctance for Native men creates this strange position where Native American men in colonial writings not only need to rape, but need to be raped in order to become men. And so you get this really strange and violent position that they're placed within. Now, even past early colonial writings, the way the law gets written around Native Americans is particularly problematic. In 1885, Congress passed the Major Crimes Act, which took away the ability for tribes to try perpetrators of serious assault and rape. Now, the responsibility to try and investigate these things was supposed to fall on the Department of Justice, but U.S. attorneys declined to investigate 75% of all crimes that fit in these categories. Though on top of that, in 1978, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in Oliphant v. Schoolmash Tribe of Indians that Native governments cannot try non-natives at all on reservations. So with a problem where 9 in 10 of the perpetrators are not from our communities, this is a huge problem. So how is this going on? And how do we grapple with this? Now, you see, in 2013, Congress tried to address this in something called the Reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act. It was supposed to expand protections to Native women and defer some authority to tribes in grappling with this. This was an apparently good move, but it had a lot of problems. First and foremost, for it to be domestic violence or for it to be stalking, the perpetrator had to have cohabitated with the victim at one point and be described as an intimate partner. A second problem with this was that for it to be domestic violence, there had to be proof of serious bodily injury, a term that's not defined in the Act, and when less than half of Native women are described as needing medical services, this is a huge problem. For it to be considered stalking, for example, there had to be a violation of a formal protection order, but those are expensive and difficult to get and often worlds away for Native people. And finally, none of this Act addresses any of the things that happen to Native men. Less than 1/4 of Native men are described as needing medical services or have been seriously injured in reports. The definition for rape in this Act does not include being made to penetrate. And fundamentally, it doesn't address these structural characteristics of how sexual violence gets talked and approached by officers of the law. So while it appears to do something good, it really isn't doing much for our communities. It just creates this illusion that the U.S. government is tackling a problem that it itself is kind of responsible for. So what do? How do we handle this? At the broadest level, we need to be dismantling the laws and practices that have made this policy come into being. We need to be overturning and making undone court cases that, are based on 100-year-old racist ideas about Native incompetency. As students and scholars, we need to be changing the way that we're talking about masculinity. We need to be changing the way that we're approaching sexual violence, and we need to be directing our time, energy, and resources to Native struggles, because everything that takes powers away from Native people feeds back into this very problem. This is not what our communities are doing. Native feminists have been grappling with this issue for decades. It's what non-natives have been doing to us, which means the onus is on them to change their behavior, their communities, and the way that they're interacting with Native Americans.